Good evening and welcome to The Square. Tonight is a timely discussion. We're going to focus on regional trade and integration amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. We're going to look at extreme measures that need to be taken. We're going to look at what's in the pipeline between institutions that facilitate trade and integration across the East African community. And we're also going to touch on the new leadership of the African Union in terms of expectations on facilitating the AfCFTA. And with us we have guests. I'm happy to welcome here with us our two guests who are going to shed their expert opinion on this topic for tonight. I'll start by welcoming Mr. Andrew Mould. Andrew Mould is the Chief Regional Integration and AfCFTA Cluster Sub-Regional Office for Eastern Africa at UNECA. Andrew, great to have you on the show.
Thank you very much. Good evening.
We're also joined by Mr. Dennis Carrera, who is the East African Business Council Vice Chairman, also the focal point for the AfCFTA. Mr. Carrera, thank you for joining us on The Square tonight.
Thank you very much and good evening.
Great. My name is Diana Mpisi, host of The Square. As always, I'm joined by The Square's resident panelists. I'll start by welcoming you, Charles. Great to have you on the show as always.
Same here, Diana. How are you?
Good.
You've been vaccinated?
No. That's a very interesting topic we're looking to having fun on The Square. Berna Namata, also a resident panelist of the show. Berna Namata, great to have you on The Square.
Thank you, Diana. Essentially, that makes her, she's not a frontline worker, so.
Yeah. But that doesn't mean I'm an anti-vaxxer, although that's a discussion we'll have another time on the show. So thank you for tuning in. Are there any midweek highlights from the resident panelists you'd like to touch on before we kick off the discussion? Charles, very quickly.
Yeah, mine is only one. Extremely thrilled that people have started getting vaccinated. I'm not too taken away by the order in which they are being vaccinated. I did see some social media conversations around why I'm a Vubi and not Square panelists, but pun intended. But I think by virtue of the fact that since last week on Tuesday, I stand to be corrected, that people started getting their jabs, we're moving.
Brenna, anything you'd like to share with the audience that caught your attention this week?
I'm not as optimistic with the vaccination. Until they actually arrive, I think we need to tread carefully.
So people are not getting jabs? You don't believe people are getting jabs?
No, it's not about that. It's about the 20% at least. Once we get to 20%, then we can talk about progress. But so far, it's still a drop in the ocean. And even when you get vaccinated now, you still have to do the same things. Wash your hands, wear your mask. And we'll continue to do that for a very long time.
Okay, definitely a discussion we have to have on The Square. Coming back to the topic tonight, regional integration and trade amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. We've seen governments across the world, notwithstanding in the East African community, ensuring lockdowns and closure of borders. Of course, this has led to a decrease in the volume of trade. There's also disruption of travel. So basically what we want to understand is the impact of this pandemic on trade and integration across the East African community. And of course, if you'll allow me, there's some figures from the World Trade Organization that projects a drop in African exports by 8% and imports by 16%. So basically, and I'll start with you, Mr. Dennis Carrera, if you can share with us key examples of the impacts on the COVID-19 pandemic has had on the East African community regarding trade and integration.
Sorry?
I would like for you to just share with us key examples of the impact that the COVID-19 pandemic has had on regional trade and integration.
Thank you, the hosts of The Square. COVID-19 has had significant impact on regional trade, significant impact. Going by the current World Bank figures, we have had a decline of 2.1%. Now, when you compare that to the regional growth that was anticipated of about 5.3%, you realize it's going to be a big challenge. We have been seriously impacted as a region and go across the sectors. Start with, for example, transport. Transport has been hit very badly in this region. Go to tourism has hit very badly in the region. go to regional supply chains, badly affected. Go to consumption patterns, very badly affected. Go to agriculture, it has had a heat, not so bad, but it hasn't done much. Go to, a couple of sectors have been hit, and we have been playing a major role of advocacy at the East African Business Council to try and see what we can do during the pandemic. What we did is to gather information, do all sorts of surveys. We went online and did as many webinars as possible, did as many online meetings. But most importantly, we wanted to share information on the entire region, across the region, on what is happening at this particular time in every country, which we did successfully. But key challenges were enormous, and we had no specific solutions. If you recall, in the recent past, we had the situation where at one time we had 15 trucks stuck between Rwanda's border with Burundi. We had 300 trucks stuck between Busia and the Uganda border. 300 trucks. That means about 20-something kilometers of mileage of stuck trucks. We had 3,000 trucks stuck between Namanga and at the Namanga border between Kenya and Tanzania. That was a very unhealthy situation. All these trucks were full of goods, items for consumption, items for industry, items for agriculture, items for tourism, and everything came to standstill. Now, this coupled with situations where countries are also in lockdowns. Lockdowns mean consumption has significantly gone down, because all the consumption that we actually do between the time of lockdown in the evening, say today in Kigali, between 5 and say past midnight, there's no consumption. So where are those goods going? What that means is either the goods are imported and not bought, or they're not imported at all. So what happens to the import regime and what happens to the export regime? So it's been a great challenge to the region. We have discussed it. We have done the due advocacy that we were meant to do. We have had engagements, for example, at border points. The most interesting thing that we actually came across was, you would think that COVID-19 took us by surprise as a region. We actually appeared more disconnected than we ever thought. Because when COVID came up, when border regulations came up, when border controls came up, when border actually closures came up, we started having very serious arguments between member states on border crossing. It became an issue, a very serious issue. And so our role actually as EABC became more of interventions, pushing our way up to borders, getting involved in meetings with the stakeholders at the borders, of course working in collaboration with all the government agencies. Our job, as it were, is advocacy, and we did that. We got involved in the conflict at Namanga, at Busia, at Rusumo. We were always there, either online or physically. Our teams were always there to make sure we push for resolution of conflict borders, to avoid congestion of trucks, because whereas border control measures were put in place to control the spread of the pandemic, what actually happened was congestion of drivers, congestion of co-drivers at borders, and countries were not necessarily ready to accommodate these people. No proper transit centers were in place. So it became a challenge, and it became actually a risk to trade. So all that together presented a very serious challenge to the region, and that's the decline that we can see in our figures currently.
Absolutely. We're going to look at hearing from you in terms of ideas of measures, exceptional measures that need to be taken or that have been taken, and just learning more about that to remedy the situation. Andrew, I will go over to you from your perspective, from UNECA, on behalf of UNECA. If you can also share with us just a general perspective on the impact this pandemic has had on regional trade and integration.
Yes, well, thank you. I don't wish to contradict what Dennis has said, because I think he's reflecting a lot of the concerns across many sectors of the economy. There have been some serious problems created by this crisis. However, just today, actually, we launched with our colleagues at Trademark East Africa and the African Economic Research Consortium a report on the trends in regional trade. And we've been following this quite closely ever since the pandemic started. And we were quite surprised, actually, the relative resilience of regional trade. There's been a bounce back in regional trade in the third and fourth quarters, even though in the initial second quarter, the kind of problems you were identifying were very real. Very substantial problems in the borders, the delays that were caused. However, I think some measures were put in place already in those in the subsequent months, which managed to mitigate some of those initial problems. So we found some of those delays, and I think it's thanks partly to the advocacy work you were doing to draw attention to the problems that specific sectors and the transport sector was having. One interesting suggestion actually came from the CEO of the EABC in our meeting this morning, actually, was you were talking earlier about the vaccination rollout. A suggestion was to prioritize the truck drivers, for example. That may very much help in terms of reducing delays at the frontier. So we've been tracking basically what have the trends been in regional trade, and we were pleasantly surprised to see this bounce back in regional exports. Imports are still down generally for countries in the region, but exports for 4 of the 5 EAC countries where we had the data actually had been positively growing. Rwanda actually quite impressively so compared to 2019 levels. So that's quite an achievement given the scale of the global pandemic. What are the problems going forward? Well, we've seen firstly informal traders very badly affected. All those cross-border communities which are highly dependent on this kind of trade, they have been very negatively impacted by the crisis across the region. We've also seen that some of the advances there were in trade facilitation over recent years in terms of reducing cargo times from Mombasa, from Dar es Salaam, have been set back because of these problems in the logistics over these months. So there is a lot of things that still need tackling, but I think the region should be relatively pleased in the sense that it's managed to put in place quite effectively some measures to address some of those immediate challenges that we saw in the second quarter of last year.
I'll get back to you to just be a bit more specific in terms of some of the measures that have taken place for the benefit of our viewers and also for the panel. You know, just in layman's terms, what's happening to actually ease and facilitate some of the issues that, you know, when the pandemic hit that really affected, you know, all the players in the regional trade chain. Charles, I'll kick off with you if you'd like to share, you know, your views also based on what our guests have just shared.
You know, throughout the last 1.5 years, plus almost 2 years, the square post-COVID, we've been talking about some of the positive impacts of COVID.
The silver linings, so to speak.
And the optimist in me tends to toe that line. Listening to Dennis gives me, like, paints to me a very good picture, and I actually think about the huge opportunity around inward importation, if that word exists, so exports within the region or internal consumption within the regions. And sometimes you look at these things and you say, pre-COVID, even if you take a very, very simple example of fruits and vegetables, you know, especially perishables, for a very long time, we had a huge dependence on mangoes from out of Rwanda. And then if you look at fish, a lot of fish that comes from as far back as China. So if fish is going to come and get shipped and delayed at the Tanzania border, and we're being told of 300 kilometers at the Namanga border, and you know what that means to you and I who like our filet. So two things. One, every challenge presents an opportunity. But then the other thing is, and it's sort of a rhetoric question that either at the EUBC level or even at our own level as the business community in our respective countries, isn't this an opportunity to ourselves? Doesn't this mean that we have actually been given a rude awakening, that the sooner we can be self-sustaining, the better for ourselves? Yeah, and I on that note, at the risk of sounding sarcastic, I like COVID.
Okay.
Yes.
Berna, I'm sure you don't like COVID, as Charles said. I know that was, I know that was tongue in cheek.
Tongue in cheek,
Absolutely.
obviously, yes.
Berna, your thoughts?
I think overall, if you look at the response from the region and the continent, there's been so much progress. I mean, when you compare before COVID, how much work was being done around integration, I actually think that the region did so much work during COVID. Let us not forget that the negotiations around the CFTA were concluded during COVID. That is one. But two, I hope that now the politicians understand that regional integration has to work. It's not an option. It is a necessity. It is an imperative. And you have to do everything that you can to protect regional integration. Because
now more than ever.
More than ever, and be pragmatic around these issues. Because we don't have to be best friends with our neighbors. We only have to understand our mutual interests and just focus on that, because that's what you need with regional integration. And I hope that COVID has taught us that. Because ultimately what we saw, for instance, at the beginning, every country was closing its borders, and there was a lot of disconnect around what do we do. And then, of course, came the stalemate in terms of it became very clear in their eyes, since everybody is applying what they think is the right thing to do for their population, and then you have containers that can't move. And then quickly they realized, no, we actually need to talk. And they began talking, and then we saw the goods move. So I feel that going forward, that is a lesson learned. Secondly, again, because of what the crisis has done, what Dennis was talking about, if you look at the shocks on regional economies, regional integration provides the opportunity to save money. And how? If you can trade with your neighbors, it's less costly, it's more efficient than trading from someone who is so far away. So I hope that going forward, we will not lose momentum that we have gained as a result of the crisis. Thirdly, and my last input on this, again, because of the shocks on the economy, we don't have several options in terms of revenue. So you have to think very carefully about the composition of your import bill, because you don't really have the forex to trade, in terms of import. So we know that many, countries in the region, of course, if you look at compare import and export, of course, the export base remains quite low, So again, we are seeing the potential around regional integration. So for me, I feel that COVID has been the turning point, and hopefully we'll continue on that path. Digital commerce, what we are seeing with e-commerce, again, as a result of COVID.
Dennis and Andrew, and I'll kick off with you. Dennis, if you could just share, because this show is very solution-oriented, what measures have taken place to remedy some of the situations you mentioned, at the beginning of the pandemic, and especially from governments that are landlocked. I think the fact that landlocked countries are the ones who suffer the brunt, of course, when it comes to regional trade and integration. If you could share with us from your perspective, on behalf of the business community, some of the remedial measures that have been taken by governments to ease regional trade and facilitation.
Thank you. There have been a couple of initiatives undertaken by governments across the region. I remember what we started advocating for was, was it possible to have a harmonized approach on all measures being taken so that it works in harmony. And as you recall, that harmony was there at some point. There's a time I remember we used to exchange information on how many cases of COVID have been identified in all the countries across. The ministers of health across the region shared information regularly, but at some point I think there was a drop here and there. So the common measures across the region at some point tended to be more rhetoric than actually actionable activities deliberately designed to prevent the spread of the disease. It was a challenge because we never picked on one uniform method. And at some point, actually, some countries, as you know, declared COVID was gone. And in some other countries, the measures were not as serious, so to speak, as it were, for example, in Rwanda. If you look at the measures of control and measures of, including social distancing, including control with the borders, including establishment of the transit points of the drivers, including exchange of the drivers, including exchange of cargo, the cargo points at Rusumo, from one truck to another, so that it was a very deliberate intention by government to prevent the spread of the disease. But it became a different matter, and at some point it actually became politicized. The business community in some of the member states became a little aggressive. They thought they were losing market. They thought crossing the border into Rwanda, heading to DRC, is a part of the journey they were losing out. And so as a way, say, of punishing, silently though, the other members, some people would make it difficult for Rwandan drivers to go across. It became a problem. It happened in Namanga as well. Namanga to Namanga border, Kenya to Tanzania. Trading became completely difficult. I'm sure everybody recalls, viewers will recall, a couple of closure meetings and opening meetings for the border in Namanga, 5-6 times. So all that happened. Now, what we did is to continuously keep engaging the stakeholders, the key stakeholders, the ministers, the heads of business chambers, and the other private sector organizations. But primarily, and I want to reflect on what Charles said about COVID-19 being a wake-up call on the way we do business. And he points to can we try and go more industrialization than we actually are, so that once we are hit by another something, not necessarily a pandemic, where do we get the inputs from? Supposing there was a tsunami coming up the Indian Ocean again, and it hits the entire coast in the worst of styles, what will we do? Yes, you can try, and we have to. We deliberately have to try industrialization. But you see, it's a whole network of things. It's all linked. You try to industrialize, you need consumers. Consumers need disposable income. Disposable income is derived from the jobs that we have in our market. When you consider that Dennis alone has now over 64 of my workers are out of jobs. In Kenya alone, the impact of COVID had 137,872 job losses. Our tourism industry in Kigali, in Rwanda rather, had at some point recently, had over 3,000 job losses. So you need to think through who is actually going to be buying my products. Where is he or she going to be getting the money? So considering also that SMEs have been downsized to almost nothing because of this pandemic. So we need serious interventions by government, and so far we are happy with what governments have done. The whole regime of working very hard to introduce vaccines. I'm reliably informed Rwanda is on course with the vaccines. I'm not so sure about the other members in the region, but vaccination is one thing. Then the other measures that have been in place. You know, there's a tendency of taking it easy, but it's not easy. The pandemic is real. It's never been taken lightly. So the measures across the region, we always want, on our part, we carry messages across the region. Let's have a harmonized way. Let's have masks all over the place. Let's have social distancing. Let's wash our hands. Let's, observe the guidelines, although sometimes, of course, it becomes simply something of conversation. Yeah, social distancing, it becomes an easy matter, but it is not. And we need to rethink, as Charles correctly puts it, we need to rethink how are we going to survive in terms of business? How are we going to improve our production capacity? How shall we improve our consumption? How shall we reinstate people into jobs? What are we going to pay them? These are critical things to look into, and it calls for the involvement of several players, those in different industries, those in the tourism sector, those in agriculture, those in transportation, those in industry. We need to see it. Bana, I think, echoed a lot on the need for regional integration. My only comment to add on what Bana says is it should cease from being rhetoric into something actionable.
Absolutely. Andrew, over to you. It's very interesting that you mentioned the resilience of regional trade and integration in the East African community despite the pandemic. Those were really, positive figures that you quoted. If you could also share with us, just from your perspective, the measures that have been put in place and what more can be done.
Yes, well, I think there's a consensus across the table here, isn't there, about not to waste this opportunity in terms of really moving ahead with the African Continental Free Trade Area. Trading, as you know, started on the 1st of January. Now, the implementation process actually for LDCs, least developed countries, is actually a 10-year period of gradual reduction in tariffs. And for countries like Kenya, it will be a 5-year period. So it will take some time to see the impact of this. But I do believe over the course of this coming decade, we're going to see a fundamental shift in the way that regional companies and firms do business. And they will start to look much more seriously at the regional market in a way that they didn't before. So that's the first thing, move ahead with the AFCFTA. We've seen some other concrete measures. Dennis mentioned a lot of the coordination efforts at the EAC level, for example, which were very important in tackling some of the trade impacts. Trademark supported the rollout of this electronic system for tracking the truck drivers to make sure that all the permissions were smoothly transferred from one country to another. That was a very helpful measure as well. So, I think there's been some interesting innovations over this last few months to deal with some of the really quite serious disruption we saw when this crisis hit. But the long-term story has to be the AFCFTA. They say never waste a good crisis. This is an opportunity for resetting the button, I think, and thinking much more seriously about how to move forward. And I personally feel there's some good signs on the way. So, for example, my understanding is the Democratic Republic of Congo is a few days away from ratifying the AFCFTA. We have a number of other countries in the East African community which still have to ratify, but our understanding is they're also considering ratification fairly soon as well. And it is important that the EAC as a bloc moves forward with this process together, because we have a common customs union in this area, so we have a common external tariff as well. And as a customs union, it's important that the countries move forward with the liberalisation under the AFCFTA together. So, I think there's a lot of work to do, but we're very optimistic, that things are going to change quite abruptly. And as Berna said, this crisis might provide a catalyst for the right changes.
That's true. Before we, yes, based on what our
if I may,
yes, Dennis.
Just compliment what Andrew is saying. I think Bana earlier on alluded to the importance of regional integration, which we have said over the years, and it has had its successes, it has had its challenges. But to be very frank with you, I personally don't get worried so much about regional integration, the challenges we've meeting in the face of the upcoming ACFTA operations. Because I'll give you an example that we discussed over time, and it did seem to be hitting a dead end at every time. We discussed liberalization of airspace in East Africa for the last 8 years. We presented a paper fully funded by DFID, done by a very good consultant. We presented it at the Head of State Summit, and everybody was keenly listening to the contents of this paper. Very well done, highlighting the benefits of liberalizing airspace of the East African community. What happened later? When we left the summit, each country went back to its original position. Nothing was actually done. So you can imagine we pushed that for 8 years. And I remember raising this and pointing out in one of our engagements with the heads of state, suggesting that, look, we can actually neglect the regional liberalization of airspace. Let's go continental. After all, what does it mean? You fly in the region. If you don't want us to fly in your region, we'll fly to a different country across the continent. And that will be a wake-up call to smaller regions that don't want to open up for regional trade. So those are some of the things we keep doing. We push to see what actually makes business. CFTA is the chance, is an opportunity and a chance we have that we need to take advantage of. And the other things that, of course, have been done is to try and push currently for tax holidays. We need serious tax holidays just to bring back to bring back life in our economy. We need harmonized tax holidays applied across the region, and as well as things like a common regime of, say, if you are giving vaccines, give to drivers across the region, not particularly one country, and then when the other country starts criticizing the other for taking a lead in doing the right thing. Thank you.
Thank you. Andrew and Dennis, you beat me to the next part of the conversation, which was basically on the AFCFTA, but really from the angle of your expectations, our expectations of the new leadership at the African Union. I think all of us know that there's been a new leadership. Musa Faki was re-elected, of course, as the head of the chair of the African Union Commission. We also have the new deputy from Rwanda, Dr. Monique Nsanzabaganwa, as well as DRC President Felix Tshisekedi taking over from South Africa as the AU chair. So I want us to just have a discussion with this new leadership at the AU. What message can we put to this new leadership in terms of very many aspects? First of all, 2020 was supposed to be the silence of the guns. Charles, I know we've talked about this on the show in terms of ending conflict so we can, as a continent, focus on continental trade. So these are some of the things that I want us to touch upon. What message can this particular topic on the show share to these leaders in terms of our expectations on really, despite the pandemic, on really facilitating the implementation of the AFCFTA? And before we get to that, I'd just like to hear from the Square resident panelists if you have anything to comment based on what Andrew and Dennis just said. Brenna, I'll quickly start with you.
Just to say that integration has to work for ordinary people. You know, it has to get out of boardrooms because we see, of course, many meetings, but the common person has to really feel integration. I'll give you an example. At the moment, what we have seen with COVID, again, around informal trade, we have so many small-scale market vendors that have struggled to get produce because of restrictions, not just across borders, but even within the country, you know. And this is because you find that most of these small-scale traders, mostly women, should wake up at 4, take a bus, and maybe go up to Cyangugu or somewhere, and bring something back to Kigali, you know, by midday. And then she's in Chimurongo, you know. Right now, with the restriction of movement, because when they restricted movement, they said, no, it's okay if goods can move.
But not people.
But not people. But these small-scale, market vendors actually move with their goods, Yes. So we need to start thinking about ordinary people. How do we make integration work for ordinary people? You know, take it beyond the advanced talk around, for instance, it's good that we're having the push towards digital payments, but let's first do the basics. You know, in my view, I think that's really, really crucial.
Absolutely. I agree with you. Charles?
Dana, your choice of guests today are two seasoned diplomats. Luckily for us, Dennis has a military kofia and a business kofia, and then
He's a diplomat too.
and a diplomat kofia, so he's extremely well fit. But the point is, you cannot live with a fire in your house and say, no, let me first wait to put out my fire and go and put out my neighbor's fire, or and go and put out the fire of the entire village. And I want to put this in context, the East African region versus the African continent. Look at the political will and how much it waned in as far as the East African business environment is concerned. Look at all this rhetoric of, and again, the reason why I said the diplomats who are our guests is that they will shy away from dropping names, whereas we can. President Museveni sat down and said, I don't see why Uganda needs a railway when Tanzania has one. Then President Magufuli says, I don't see why I need an airline when Rwanda is doing an extremely good job. Fast forward, everyone is fighting to put up their own airline. Do you know what's happening today? Is that we are cannibalizing each other on the little airspace that we have, and it's at the loss of everybody. So we want to export our inability to the entire continent.
From an East African regional economic bloc.
Yes. But that political rhetoric that we have failed to put into practice at the East African level, how else? How are we going to be able to put it out at the continental level? And that brings me to my second point, and that's the importance of politics. In 2021, Uganda went through an election. In 2022, Kenya is going to go through an election. In 2020, Burundi and Tanzania went through an election. In 2024, Rwanda is going to go through an election. You never underestimate the importance of political survival for the business good. Now, I'll take it a notch higher. Tshisekedi has just been appointed president of the African Union. He's undergoing a turbulent time back home. What balls does he have, excuse my Spanish, to lead the continent when his house is on fire? He's just appointed a prime minister and so on and so forth. So we need, and this sort of plays to the earlier point we spoke at the first quarter of the show, that if all governments, with no exception, have gone to the private sector to say, we have, as governments, an obligation to feed our people during these tough COVID times. We have an obligation as governments to drop taxes, to defer payments of our obligations left, right, and center. And private sector has benefited from this, and they've lobbied highly from this. So it basically means the private sector is in the driving seat. It's high time that they said, you know what? You guys in these elective positions cannot continue driving us in a direction that we are not too sure of. Maybe pre-COVID we did not know about this. But we have just shown that the private sector is feeding people. And I'll give you the second example. You wait for the vaccines. You see, today what's happening is vaccines are located. And I know we're going to talk about this on the square, on another forum. But we will decide that as a government who gets vaccinated when. But that will be only to a small proportion of those who the government has an obligation to take care of. In the context of Rwanda, I don't think that's even 5%. The rest will be private sector's real obligation. So if private sector is going to be, if we are going to run to private sector for vaccination, run to private sector for Jirinha, run to private sector for all these other programs, all these other campaigns, I think everybody should, I mean, the likes of Robert, Bapakurera, and everybody else should say, no, you know what? Yes, we will support, but the terms are XYZ.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We are running out of time. I'd like to hear from Dennis and Andrew. I'll start with you, Andrew, just on the feedback our resident panelists have shared, as well as just reining you back into what expectations should we have in place, or what do we expect from the new leadership of the AU in terms of implementing and making sure the AFCFTA is a reality. Very quickly, over to you, Andrew.
Well, I think what Charles is saying is quite right about, the political economy of regional integration is fundamental. With all regional integration processes, I think you see it's a process of one step forward and two steps back. If you look at the history of the European Union, particularly the recent history, for example, it hasn't been exactly untroubled, has it? But still, they've managed to maintain a certain political momentum to achieve a relatively high degree of integration, and I think that's the challenge for the African continent. My own feeling is the economic logic behind deeper integration in East Africa and across the continent is so compelling that really you can't ignore the arguments. Okay, so for example, Dennis was talking about the importance of diversifying into industrial goods, but where is the purchasing power to buy those goods? Well, if you look at extra-regional trade, the products which are exported from East Africa to the rest of the world, they tend to be relatively undiversified exports. They tend to be primary commodities, horticultural goods and the like, where the consumption of diversified goods is in the region. Around 2/3 of EAC trade, intra-regional trade, is actually diversified goods. So my argument has always been, if you want to push the diversification and the value added of your economy, the regional route is the way to go. It's not promoting greater exports either to the US market, the European market, or elsewhere. It's actually to look within the regional boundaries, and there you'll find markets of great potential. And there's a number of indicators which reveal that potential. So, for example, if you look at profit rates in a lot of sectors of interest across the region, you'll find that levels of profitability are actually quite high in things like food processing, in some of the service sectors, very high rates of return. So a lot of these manufacturing industries are underinvested currently, and I think the AFCFTA will make people realize, that the opportunities are actually on their doorstep, not so far away as Western Europe or further afield.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Over to you, Dennis.
Thank you. I'll touch on a few things I think Charles said and yourself. One is the opportunities around us. East African Business Council, working along the East African Community Secretariat, of course, is pursuing the route of ACFTA aggressively, and that's specifically my job, working hand in hand with Andrew here. We need to get into the proper action of the ACFTA. It's the only survival. Somebody talked about DRC and saying the president has just become the chair. Yes, while he becomes the chair, we are also working very hard to integrate the Chamber of Commerce of DRC into the EABC. So, you keep trying these things. When one neighbor doesn't perform to excellence, we go with another. We've been putting South Sudan into the organization. We are putting now DRC to be integrated, actually to join the EABC ahead of the political integration, which is also coming soon, as you know. So we have hope in the leadership of the AU, certainly. Charles mentioned we are diplomats and business people at the same time. But we trust the leadership at the AU. Particularly, SCFTA has champions who back up the activities of the AU Commission. So there's the president of Chad, as you know, the champion. There's our president here, President Kagame. There's a few heads of state. There's the Afro champions, if you know, who are all spearheading the activity of SCFTA to see it happen. Needless to say that the success of SCFTA will depend on how organized are we as regional trade blocs. Are we actually going as blocs or individually? I was having a conversation with Andrew earlier. He's finishing the strategy for Rwanda, Rwanda's action into the CFTA, as well as the regional strategy is also being made. Soon I'll be sitting with Andrew in one of these days to go through what is actually happening in terms of actionables across the region. And for those who don't want to move on the same speed, certainly some will be left behind and people will move. But like it or not, SCFTA is the only chance that we have. Now, when you, Charles, you mentioned earlier about the politicizing of business across the region. We have found it extremely difficult to separate the two. Business and politics have been inseparable. Everything has been tried. We have had engagements across this region. We have sat with every head of state in this region and discussed and agreed that is it possible to separate politics from business? It couldn't work. So all we observed is that there's willingness, but when it, you know, when you part ways and go back to your own capitals, there is, I think there are influences that come closest to the heads of state and things change. So what has been agreed and documented is one thing, and what is actually being done is a different matter. So that is going to be around for some time, but I strongly believe it will be overtaken by events of the continental trading.
Thank you very much. Brenna, very quickly before we go to our Twitter feed.
I would throw it back to the private sector, because ideally what we know from politics, politicians cannot survive with the business community.
Cannot survive without.
Yes, without the business community.
Absolutely.
And vice versa.
Yeah, but mainly the business community, and I'll tell you how. You know, these captains of industry that we see are the ones that finance governments, whether we like it or not, you know. So he talked about the election cycle. We know what usually happens. We know that politicians will talk to a few captains of industry or business leaders and mobilize the resources they need for elections. So why can't the private sector leverage that and say, okay, yes, we funded you for the first term, second term, things have to change. I think there's room for the private sector to also be able to, you know, to
do that.
Can I give an example of the Rwandan elections?
Very quickly. I know that's it. We're going to
I will. I want to supplement the point.
No, we're running out of time. I have to be strict this time. You remember what happened last week. I really want us to keep within our time frame. I just want to quickly go to our Twitter feed. We have a couple of tweets coming in. The first is from Lucy Mbabazi, who says that most in the private sector conduct business in cash, especially at borders. COVID-19 further proved business as usual cannot continue. Does EABC now see the digitization of payments as a must for recovery? If yes, what are they doing and what's needed to accelerate? Very quickly over to you, Dennis. In very few minutes, what is the digitization process at EABC?
As a matter of fact, I must commend the money market and digitization of trade across the region. Sincerely, if we didn't go digital, I don't see how much we are going to be able to do. First of all, we are going to have a significant spread of this disease if we didn't address the matter of handling cash directly. That was going to be a very serious challenge. So I must commend people in the financial sector. We need that. And as we say, as we are going continental, it will be hard to move cash. First of all, it's no longer allowed worldwide anyway to move with pockets full of dollars. So how are we going to trade across the continent? So we need to harmonize our systems. We need to improve on our cyber security, though, because you see, the habits, the inner habits of the brain of criminals is that as you plan to go digital, they are plan how to undo what you're doing.
Absolutely.
So these are the expectations that we should be looking at. So our cyber security should be so thorough, because payments across the continent, as we go African trading, it's not going to be. We're not going to be sending cash. We're not going to be doing what do you call it? Easy transfer or Western Union. First of all, Western Union is no longer allowed to transfer certain amounts of money. So we have to go digital and across the continent, by the way. If you go to some countries, you will notice that some countries take it easy. Lightly. The whole effect of the internet penetration is not as significant as you see it in Rwanda here. And that's what we need. Otherwise, how am I going to pay my suppliers in Cairo, for example? How am I going to pay my suppliers in Johannesburg? I will not need to carry cash, but the efforts being made, for example, in the region, by the way, have been significant. If you see the example of M-Pesa and mobile money operations here, M-Pesa is one of our success stories, by the way, not just in the region, not in Africa, but the European Union has come to us as East African Business Council to ask us to tell them the success story of M-Pesa and whether it can be emulated in Europe.
Okay. Last tweet for the evening. We have a tweet again from Lucy Mbabazi saying that excellent panel and discussion. Love the passion and eloquence of the two guests in delivering the urgent need for serious action to actualize the promise of true regional integration, especially from trade. We've come to the end of the topic. Unfortunately, topics like this on the square, the time runs it runs by so quickly. I would just like to hear closing remarks. Really, if you can do it in the shortest time as possible, Andrew and Dennis, your closing remarks. I'll start with you, Andrew.
Oh, well, I actually not quite sure what to say. I think there was a degree of consensus amongst us that
that's true. That's true.
We didn't have much to disagree on, did we? Really, the way forward is definitely the African Continental Free Trade Area. I do stress when I talk about this that we're not going to see changes within a few months. It will take quite a long time to implement. So it's not a measure exactly to counteract all these negative impacts of the COVID crisis. I think it's a long-term story.
Thank you.
But we will see fundamental changes, I believe, in the region over the next decade because of this program of continental integration.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Closing remarks, over to you, Dennis.
I think one of the things we got to do, and alluding to what Charles commented on earlier, the support of the private sector in all situations, in elections, in the pandemic. I think it's inevitable and it's critical that we protect our consumers. I'm always speaking to different people, and if we don't protect our consumers, what are we doing in business? So we're not going to go far as long as our consumers are sick, are impoverished, they have no money. So it makes sense that invest in people, and therefore they can come back and buy from you. We will not progress in business unless they are consumers.
Thank you very much, Dennis. Charles, I'm sorry we don't have time. Bern, I'm very
I wanted to
sorry.
educate Bana.
I know you're going to kill me after this show, but I think this is something we definitely need a repeat of this sort of conversation with different actors, with different guests. But I'd like to thank our guests, Mr. Carrera and Mr. Moles. Thank you very much. Like one of our viewers said, very eloquently put, very informative and insightful comments and views that you have shared with us. So thank you very much on behalf of the Square. I'd like to thank you, Brenna, as always. Very valid points. Charles, very valid points put across. I like the debate that keeps on going on. To viewers, thank you very much for tuning in. It's always a pleasure. I'd like to also thank our partners, as always, Uzi Collections and Bourbon Coffee for supporting the Square. To our viewers, keep the conversation going using the hashtag #thesquare.rw on our Twitter platform. Unfortunately, we didn't have time to read all the tweets, but we'll definitely engage with you after the show. Thank you for tuning in. Have a good night and see you again next week. Thank you.
RBA app is here. How'd you get it? It is easier than ever. Go on your home screen. Press Play Store or App Store. Type RBA. Search. There you go. You have RBA app.